Hello, this is Deb Del Vecchio-Scully. I am a licensed professional counselor who visited your community in early January. And at the request of several of the attendees, I am recording the slides I presented live to you as a webinar so that you can have it as a resource. And for those of you who weren't able to be present in the room with us, to be able to listen and learn. I am a licensed professional counselor, a nationally certified counselor, and hold certifications in neurofeedback, EMDR, yoga therapy, clinical hypnosis. I am a Reiki master and have studied trauma-focused art therapy. More importantly, I am a Connecticut resident who lives approximately 30 minutes from Sandy Hook, Connecticut. And also, unfortunately, am in rather close proximity to New York City. And as a result of the terror attacks on 9/11 and the Sandy Hook shooting, I have become an expert in trauma, but particularly communal trauma. When the Sandy Hook school shooting happened, it was a seemingly normal day. It was bright, crisp, and clear. Sky was a clear blue. And at the Sandy Hook school, the first grade classrooms were abuzz because they were making gingerbread houses later that morning. And then everything changed. As a human being, I am forever changed by that event. But as a professional mental health counselor, I jumped into action immediately. At the time, I was the executive director of the Connecticut Counseling Association, which is a professional organization of counselors, and immediately began to take action in providing resources and support. Immediately became a pro bono volunteer, and with varied roles. I was an advocate for a family whose son had escaped one of the first grade classrooms the shooter entered, eventually becoming an advocate for all of the families of those two classrooms. I was providing pro bono counseling however and wherever was needed, volunteered at many, many events, and eventually became the clinical recovery leader for the entire Newtown community. As a part of that role, I was embedded at the Sandy Hook Elementary School for staff support for a little over 2 years. Prior to that, unfortunately, Connecticut was directly impacted by the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and I have provided services to many survivors, some who had lost loved ones that day, others who survived the event themselves, and have been very active at conferences supporting other therapists and survivors in the long-term impact of communal trauma. I hope that I have information to share today that you're going to find helpful as you move closer to the first anniversary of the Stoneman Douglas shooting. One of the most important messages I can share with you is after a communal trauma, but particularly a school shooting, we are all wounded as individuals, but we heal collectively in community. Having a group that you can rely on who is truly supportive and helpful is going to be key in navigating how you move forward. Remembering again and again, together we rise. So what is trauma? Well, first and foremost, it's an absolutely normal reaction to a highly abnormal situation. It is automatic. This is not something that a person chooses or chooses not to have. The brain is responding to the threat it perceives. And with that come a host of physiological changes, meaning your brain creates a chain reaction in your body and in your brain instantaneously. So there is a flooding of stress hormones, such as epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, adrenaline. This happens to everyone and can happen to anyone. It will not get better on its own. Unlike other psychological problems or concerns that might improve on their own with family support, trauma isn't one of those. There is a trauma wound that's being held in the brain that, unless you have very specific types of treatments, doesn't improve and unfortunately doesn't go away. We know this based on decades of research that showed us after all of the major wars, even going back to the World War I and World War II, where we use the term shell-shocked. That was trauma. We know from all of the Vietnam veterans when they came home to a country that, first of all, did not welcome them home, and that there really were no services for. They were the walking wounded for decades until the mental health community was able to more clearly identify what happens after being exposed to extreme terror and violence. And while I use war as an example, I want to be very clear that anyone can experience trauma. It just depends on an exposure to a particular type of event. And it serves no one to compare my pain to someone else's with statements like, oh, they have it so much worse than I do. Comparing pain hurts everyone and helps no one. A few points that I think are important. Medications can be helpful, but they are not a substitute for counseling. In fact, there's a randomized controlled study that showed EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, was 6 times more effective in treating trauma than antidepressant medication. I'm not saying that medication isn't appropriate. It may very well be appropriate. Just know that it isn't treatment in and of itself. Trauma has many symptoms, which I'll go over with you. One of the main criteria is that you must have been exposed or witnessed a traumatic event and felt that your life was at risk. Now, I would expand this a bit, as I feel certainly the threat that to a child absolutely can equal PTSD. I think there can be vicarious trauma from watching images on television, such as from 9/11 and many other things. Now, honestly, that's not in line with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is what therapists use to make diagnoses. However, for those of us who work in the field, we simply know that it isn't true. Trauma does require specialized treatment by behavioral health specialists in trauma. A part of your work is to be able to know the questions to ask and able to discern if this is going to be a good fit for yourself or for your child. To best understand trauma, you must have a basic understanding of the brain. The triune brain is considered 3 brains in one. The lowest part of the brain is considered the reptilian brain. The mid part of the limbic system is responsible for all emotional functions. And the neocortex, or the very top part of the brain, is responsible for all executive functions, such as learning, organization, and even making sense of information. We know that the brain forms and develops sequentially bottom up, from the brainstem working up into the limbic system, and then up to the neocortex. This is important when we talk about having a dysregulated brain and how we can best help children and adults heal and recover from trauma. What's really important to understand is that the limbic system is hijacked by trauma and it lacks insight. So it is highly reactive without really knowing why or how to interrupt or change that. So understanding a little bit about what happens in the brain, the amygdala and the limbic system are really hijacked by trauma. Amygdala is the body's alarm system or the fear center. It's really designed to recognize danger and threats, which we need in our lives to help keep ourselves safe. However, after there is a trauma event, the lower brain is unable to discern between what is now a true threat versus what is a remembered threat. And sometimes it feels like that alarm system has become faulty and will send out false alarms, otherwise known as triggers to events. We can have that fight, flight, or freeze response multiple times during the day. And so the fight or freeze response is our body's response to stress. The moment that we perceive something as stressful, it kicks off the brain's stress response to help us flee that situation. Now, the reality is, most things that we encounter, there's nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. We will eventually develop high levels of cortisol, which can lead to several other health issues. And it's really important to understand that the higher functions of the brain are considered non-essential in a crisis and is shut down once we've activated that fight, flight, or freeze response. The really important thing to understand is that we know some made the ultimate sacrifice and had the most significant loss, but everyone has been impacted by this loss. I want to talk to you about the window of tolerance and helping you to understand what this is, what this means, and how you can use this as a framework to describe what you're experiencing, but also to help your child understand what they're experiencing. What we want for all of us is to be functioning most of the time within a window of tolerance where we feel good, well. And we might rise to the top of that window under stress or down to the bottom of it, depending just on the way that we tend to cope. But for the most part, we're able to ride the waves of stressors and stay well within that window of tolerance. When trauma occurs, that becomes really difficult to do. If someone becomes triggered by an event, they may begin to escalate and become agitated, anxious, upset, and eventually come out of the window of tolerance into a place of dysregulation. Dysregulation is when you begin to feel agitated, uncomfortable, could be anxious, a feeling of being revved up, also could be feeling angry or irritable, not out of control, but absolutely uncomfortable. If that continues without interruption, it's going to escalate into something we call hyperarousal. And this is when someone is highly anxious, irritable, angry, in high alert. They may have just a wild expression in their eyes. That person may want to physically fight and become physically acting out, or try to flee or run away. This is also known as hypervigilance. Now, another way that someone might experience being triggered is to drop down out of the window of tolerance. This is more of a shutting down experience or a numbing experience. It may feel like you may be disconnected, a little bit of spaciness, and you feel like you've lost track of time. Not out of control yet, but definitely uncomfortable. If this continues unchecked, you will descend into a space considered hypoarousal. Hypoarousal is feeling completely zoned out, checked out, as though you're watching a movie that's your life, but you're not in it. Things feel kind of far away. It can also feel like you're walking through mud, or it's hard to think, concentrate, or focus. It isn't something you choose, and actually is considered to be a coping skill initially following a trauma. But with time, this can become a habit, and this, what's also called dissociation, can take over your life and really lead to a really unpleasant experience. Many have asked about what to expect. What's next? How do we know and how do we prepare? And so this graph was actually created when looking at the effects of depression and other types of mental illness on individuals, but has been applied when we look at the aftermath of crisis and trauma. And when you look at this, right now, if you look like, I would imagine that most are feeling like you're in this disillusionment area. Immediately following a tragedy, there is a spike in positive, right? It's that rebound effect, and what we also will refer to as the honeymoon effect. There's cohesion, meaning the community comes together. Different organizations are created in the aftermath. And all of this just creates a sense of hope and community after something that is incredibly fracturing and painful and surreal and impossible to understand. That lasts for a bit of time, but eventually that's going to start to change because it's really a reaction and not necessarily a phase of authentic healing yet. That emotional high will start to drop. And as you move closer and closer to the first anniversary, we see that as a community and as individuals, people start to drop down into a place that's been called disillusionment. This can also just be a space of higher intensity of feelings, remembering what was happening in your life prior to the event. Generally, people find that they're more triggered, more easily triggered. And there's an up and down, particularly in this area, where there's one step forward, two steps back, is very common. And the goal here really is emotional tolerance, riding the wave of this, and education, I think, is enormously helpful as you're listening to this and learning more about what to expect. Through this period of time, we will deal with the anniversary reactions. And while I think this is a very good conceptualization, I don't feel like it happens very neatly in 1 year. Particularly after a school shooting, I think this process, this up and down process, can continue for years afterwards. There's so many other factors that contribute to this. It's how does the community come together in a more realistic way? How does the community heal together, and how are people healing individually? Do other things happen in the community? The Parkland community was hit pretty hard by the hurricane in the previous fall, with many people still dealing with that fallout. So as a stressed community to begin with, that just adds another layer to the recovery. Another key way to kind of conceptualize and think about this, something that I call patterns of disruption. And here we look at how people were before an event happens and how they recover afterwards. Because absolutely who you were before is who you are after. And so if you were someone or your family was in a really strong, healthy place, you might have had stressors, but you also had the skills to ride them out, to cope and deal with them. You're likely going to be able to fall into a place of fostering resilience far more easily than others and do so much more quickly. I do think the earlier people receive professional counseling will determine how you impact this trajectory as well. But it's never too late to get treatment. We see that, those who maybe had moderate stressors to begin with, perhaps the effect of the hurricane was stronger for you or your family or loved ones, or there are other stressors. You had sick relatives, or some other issue, financial concerns. And you might have had moderate stress at the time of the shooting. You too will get to a place of recovery, and it will just look a little bit differently. But for those who have had pre-existing issues, maybe pre-existing behavioral health issues or other chronic stressors that have not been healed yet, this kind of chronic pattern will just create an up and down, up and down, up and down, kind of roller coaster ride. But the good news for wherever you see yourself on here is getting the right form of counseling, the best forms of counseling. You have the capacity and the ability to affect all of this. In this next section, I'm going to just review some of the typical signs and symptoms that you might expect to see with your child and with yourself. So, traumatized children and adolescents are likely to react to a traumatic event and also react when they're triggered with regressive and aggressive behavior. Understanding that their brains are highly dysregulated in a very uncomfortable way, and that it's hard to tolerate talking at all about anything related to the trauma. In fact, it's almost impossible. And so they will demand your attention through their behaviors. You may see them become more withdrawn or oppositional. Some classic symptoms that we would see are sleep issues, nightmares, more irritability, sadness, anxiety. So one of the questions that was asked repeatedly at our live event was, well, how do you know what's different between what is normal adolescence and what isn't? And my answer to you is, it doesn't matter. If you notice symptoms that you feel your child is uncomfortable with, that's enough to reach out for help. You will not regret taking action. You will regret not taking action and watching your child suffer. Some other symptoms is they can become increasingly clingy to adults, so as they regress, they return to earlier behaviors. They might be easily startled or jumpy, fear loud noises, really have a hard time doing some activities that were easy for them before. And their fear is at a all-time high, and that may be towards other people, it may be situations. They may not want to go to school, they may avoid school, they may be skipping school, which all can look oppositional, and it may be, but it also may be avoidance of the trauma. Some of the more subtle signs that your child might need help. Their risk-taking behavior increases and becomes even more risky than before. They begin to have a lot of trouble focusing at school. It's not ADHD, however. A good therapist can help you discern the differences. Their academic performance changes dramatically. They may have trouble sustaining their friendships or forming new friendships. They maybe become avoidant and resistant of challenges. So, for example, if, let's say, your child loved sports and was looking forward to the basketball season, and when it came time for tryouts, said, no, I'm not going to try out. I changed my mind. Now, if they could just change their mind, in my experience, any change in your child, my first thought is this trauma? And these are the conversations that I still have now, 6 years later, after Sandy Hook, with the moms that I continue to see and meet with periodically. And we just were together just before the anniversary, the 6th anniversary of Sandy Hook, and I had this conversation with one of the moms. The behaviors that she's seeing in her son is trauma because it hasn't been completely healed yet. Your child becoming increasingly more isolated, not wanting to connect within the family unit and not wanting to connect socially. Personality changes, anger, irritability, inappropriate friendships, new friendships that you just are uncomfortable with. Any of this are signs for concern and cause for action. Now, very similar with adults. I think traumatized adults typically experience a feeling of a persistent hyperarousal, meaning you're on high alert much more than you would like to be, easily triggered. You too may become withdrawn or depressed. Sleep disruptions are highly common. It's hard to fall asleep, it's hard to stay asleep, and there are nightmares. And often there are sleep avoidant behaviors because of fear of having nightmares. The anxiety may show itself as irritability, sadness, frequent tearfulness, and easily startled, fearing situations that might remind you of the shooting. Disconnection, dissociation is a very common symptom both for children and adults, which make it really hard to form relationships or connections. And unfortunately, I do think this is true for adults and for children, is self-soothing with substance abuse. It would be alcohol, marijuana, prescription medication, painkillers, are all ways that people begin to try to soothe themselves. How do you know if you need help? Again, personality changes. You are just not the person you were before this happened. You are seeing that you are taking increased risky behaviors. That could be alcohol and substance abuse, but that may also be excessive shopping, gambling, impulsivity in the form of sexual activity, marital affair. All of these things are part of recovering from communal trauma, unfortunately. You might be struggling at work. It might be difficult to focus or to concentrate. And you find yourself increasingly becoming more isolated. Now, I want you to understand a bit about your stress response because it's the key of the trauma response. In the moment that you are exposed to a stressor, whatever that is, I use the example of you're driving down the street and a car pulls out in front of you. There is an immediate automatic response, meaning you have no control over it. First thing that happens is that your pupils dilate, your blood vessels begin to shift the blood flow to your central nervous system and larger muscles. Your lungs have an increased need for oxygen. You have a higher O2 consumption. Heart rate increases. Your stomach shuts down. So basically your digestion turns off. So if any of you have been told you have irritable bowel syndrome since the event, or you're having any kind of digestive issues, it's directly related to the stress, provided that you've had a full medical workup, can be directly related to the stress of the event and the ongoing demands of coping. Your liver is pumping out high levels of glucose to give you energy to be able to physically flee the threat, even though there's no place to run or no place to hide. Your adrenal glands are on overload, pumping out epinephrine and norepinephrine. And staying in your stress response is what can happen after communal trauma, is that people begin to live in their stress responses, which then can lead to adrenal fatigue. Right. Reproductive hormones shut down. You may find yourself becoming sick more frequently, more opportunistic colds, viruses, things like that. And overall, increased muscle tension and pain. This all happens in a split second, and the effect will last until you're able to intervene in some way. So with a mild stress reaction, like a car pulling out in front of you, there's a little bit of a bump in this. So we get a stress reaction, everything is released, we feel that, but then we have a rebound. A sympathetic stress reaction releases all of this, parasympathetic rebound starts to calm it all down, and you return to normal. That's what we would expect to see. The traumatic stress reaction, you can see that there's an extreme sympathetic response and an extreme parasympathetic coactivation, meaning that both sides of the brain are trying to help you be safe through this event. And what starts to happen is this ongoing erratic up and down. So it can look like mood swings. It can feel like mood swings when it really is more the result of a traumatic stress reaction in your brain. This is what dysregulation looks like. So to summarize, traumatized brains are dysregulated and easily triggered. It impacts learning. Remember, a thinking, learning brain and a doing, high alert brain cannot operate at the same time. If a person, whether it be a student or an adult or on high alert, it's difficult, if not impossible, for them to learn. It will impact your sleep through nightmares, a persistent sense of feeling unsafe, high alert, and you will have difficulty encoding information. Trauma impacts short-term memory. You cannot take in new information, and therefore your ability to recall that information is highly impaired. This can resemble inattention or ADHD, but this is actually anxiety-based, which looks very different in the brain than a classic ADHD brain. Classic ADHD brain is actually sluggish. It moves too slowly, whereas the brain waves that are present with a traumatized brain are highly anxious and very fast.